Welcome. We're ready to begin reading the New Testament by Pentecost. But as I've said, we're not going to begin with Matthew, but with Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians. Jesus was born sometime between 4 BC and 0 by our calendars. He grew up in a small town in Galilee called Nazareth. Around his late 20s, he began an itinerant ministry after being baptized by his cousin John, and after John's arrest. He preached about the kingdom of heaven. He drew followers. Sometime around the year 30, he was arrested and crucified in Jerusalem. But the movement that he had founded didn't dissipate. Rather, they proclaimed that Christ was risen. Christ is risen indeed, that we will celebrate at Easter. A man named Saul initially didn't believe these claims. He saw these Christ followers as a dissident Jewish group who weren't following the law. He set out to persecute them, and on the road to Damascus, sometime in the early 30s, 3 or 4 years after the crucifixion, he has a personal encounter with the risen Christ that changes his life. The Gospels began being written probably around the year 70, after the destruction of Jerusalem, and we'll talk about that more later. It makes sense for the New Testament to begin with the Gospels because they are the stories of the Word made flesh, of Jesus. It makes sense for the New Testament to end with Revelation because it is about the last things. But it also makes sense to read these texts in the order they were likely written. Paul begins an itinerant ministry of his own. He begins traveling and witnessing to Jews and Gentiles alike. He begins organizing churches, but he doesn't stay with the churches. He continues to travel. In his book, Evolution of the Word, Marcus Borg writes, "The first document in this chronological reading of the New Testament is Paul's letter to a Christ community in Thessalonica, the capital city of Macedonia, a province of northern Greece. It was written around the year 50, possibly a year or two earlier. According to Acts, Paul had visited this city after having a vision of a man from Macedonia. We'll read about that in Acts 16:9. Paul stopped at Philippi, another place we'll read about, and then went on to Thessalonica. According to Acts, Paul made many converts there, and some weeks later, riots broke out. Paul left and went south to Athens and Corinth. Soon he sent Timothy back to find out how the community was doing. Consider that Timothy's trip of about 300 miles took at least a week by boat, maybe 2 or 3 by foot. It could have been a month and a half before Paul heard back. Some key insights to look for as you're reading is that this letter is Paul's response to the news that Timothy brings. He is overflowing with thanksgiving at their faithfulness in the face of difficulty. Note the extensive use of family images, brothers, sisters, siblings. This new family of Christianity is inclusive, mutually supportive. And Paul speaks to this new family of faith, hope, and love. We'll also see that early Christians, including Paul, fully expected Jesus to return in their lifetimes. But Paul is not so much focused on the mechanics of that as the transformation that he and these communities are already undergoing. He seeks to convey an assurance that God will find this new community blameless and that those who have already passed will still be included. In the big picture, this letter invites us to consider how we read Scripture. In recent times, some have seen it as a puzzle to be solved, to find out dates or answers. United Methodists don't read Scripture that way. We take it seriously, not necessarily literally. We can recognize, for example, that Paul was incorrect about his dates, while claiming the hope and assurance that he speaks of. Reading Scripture is about a relationship and our own encounter with the divine and how we share that with our neighbors in our time. We can hold that all Scripture is God-breathed and useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting and training in righteousness, as 2 Timothy tells us, while recognizing the limitations of its inspired human authors. Remember the suggestion of a notebook where you can jot things down that you notice and questions that you have. I'm confident as we begin reading, you'll start seeing all sorts of interesting connections. Blessings on your reading as we begin this journey.